I'm Michael Elliott. I am Associate Professor at Georgia Institute of Technology in the City and Regional Planning Program, and I direct the Masters in City and Regional Planning Program. I've worked with Larry for about 45 years now in the field of dispute resolution.
I am a faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, teaching in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning for a long time. I am the vice chair of the program and co-founder of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, which I helped to found 40 years ago with Roger Fisher, Frank Sander, Howard Rafa, and others. I am the founder and former director of the Consensus Building Institute, a not-for-profit in Cambridge that has, since I've left, grown with subsequent generations of my former students to become one of the leading providers of mediation services around the world in resource management disputes. Other than that, I spent some time writing books, and I'm still very engaged in practice, both through CBI and on my own.
And with us also is Bill Potopchik. Bill, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Michael. I'm Bill Potopchik. I'm president of the Community Building Institute. I teach at the Carter Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace at George Mason University, where I'm also a fellow in the Center for Peacemaking Practice.
I want us to start by just thinking back at the start of when you were working or starting to think about dispute resolution. If you could just tell us something about your early career and how it brought you to a place where you started working in conflict management and negotiation.
I went from being an undergraduate at Columbia, furious with the place and eager to get out of there as fast as I could, when they wouldn't accept the fact that urban studies could be a major. I was told by quite a few very famous men at the time, there is no such thing. I said, well, I'm making it, and this is what I want to do. And I have recruited Daniel Bell to be my advisor, and Bob Fogelson, an urban historian, to be my advisor. And they said, nope, can't do it. You better make sure you have enough credits in something else to graduate. We then closed down the university in '68 because of the war. I graduated without a graduation, but I did have enough credits to create on my graduation forms that I was both an English major and an urban studies major. I then decided to go to urban planning school, which is what I knew I wanted to do all along. And I had taken courses in urban planning as an undergraduate, which was unheard of. Literally, no one had ever at Columbia. And I convinced Charlie Abrams, who was still alive then, to let me take a studio course as an undergraduate because I wanted to see how planning was done. And Mohammed Kadir was his teaching assistant, who went on to become the head of the planning program for many decades and a close friend at York University in Canada. And I started down the road at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and the whole business started up again. I said, well, this is what I want to take. You got Pat Moynihan here. You got Nathan Glazer here. You got Don Schoen here. You got a lot of people really interesting with regard to what urban studies is. And you're telling me they won't count toward my degree at Harvard. And I started working with a young professor named Chester Hartman. And we got involved with trying to get rent control in the city of Cambridge, which we did with the large association of people, of renters that we had helped to organize. And halfway through the year, the prevailing leadership in the Graduate School of Design said, you're not going to graduate because you keep taking these courses and they're not in the required list. And I said, then screw that. And I walked down the street to MIT, and I found Bob Fogelson, who had been my Columbia undergraduate professor, who had just moved to history and urban studies at MIT. He said, well, why did you ever go there in the first place? Why don't you come here? I said, well, Harvard. You go to Harvard. I walked in, they said, sure, you can transfer, no problems. I never really formally applied. They just resurrected my earlier application and said, so you're here. Annoyed the people who ran Harvard School of Design, and I had for more than a decade, since I stayed at MIT, I had more than a decade of chilly relationships with the faculty running the School of Design, who threw Chester out, which was another reason to get out of there and not want to be any part of it. So I got to urban planning, and the thing about urban planning at MIT was make your own Sunday. No required courses. You just sit with an advisor, you say what you're taking, that's it. So that worked fine. And I was interested in the question, having studied with Moynihan and Glaser and several others, both conservative and liberal. I was interested in the question, which was very big at the time, how are you going to get people in these neighborhoods involved in making decisions? Model cities was the focus of everything, including in Cambridge, Model Cities Community. And everyone was talking like, and all the people in this place are going to have a chance to participate. And that seemed like the basis of a urban planning philosophy. And so, even though I was still a student, I was given the assignment of, you figure out how we should organize the public engagement process in the model cities communities. I said, okay, how many people do you expect? Thousands. And they're all going to participate in helping to make decisions. Yes. And we use a kind of hearing process, and people get up at a microphone and they can speak. I said, well, that doesn't sound like they're having much impact on what's going on. And I was puzzling with that question, and I began to think about planning new towns. I said, well, at least in planning a new town, you could figure out who do you want to invite to be involved, and they could help plan the new town. And we had a movement going in the US at the time called the New Communities Movement. And my new advisor, Lloyd Rodwin, at MIT thought, well, that's an interesting thing, because I'm trying to build a new city in Ciudad Guayana in Venezuela. And I got all my MIT colleagues, and we're working there. And I've got this anthropologist on our faculty named Lisa Peedy, and she keeps saying that we ought to have engagement of all the workers helping to build the new city in Ciudad Guayana. I said, too complicated for me. I'm just going to imagine new cities somewhere in the United States, green space. I read Ebenezer Howard. Now I'm going to look at green space, who are you going to get involved and how? And basically what I was doing was trying to design, without knowing it, some kind of mediated process, which includes some kind of stakeholder representation and some kind of joint fact-finding and some kind of partnership, and trying to formulate an agreement about how all that would work. And I was doing that, and I got a strange phone call from Harvard Law School from a guy named Roger Fisher. He said, we're starting something called the Harvard Negotiation Project, and we're going to bring people together from different fields, and we're going to talk about different kinds of conflicts and how they're mediated. We'd love to have you come and talk about mediation of city conflicts. I said, what's mediation? I never heard of it.
And at about this time, you were also working in Arlington and Rockport?
I was doing public participation as best we could in existing places where there were controversies that were a product of different interests wanting to do things in different ways. And my task was always to organize those conversations and to see if there was a way to not just talk at each other, but work together to produce some kind of alternative plan or option for what should be done. And I thought that was planning. So when he asked me, come and talk about mediation, I did not know what he meant. I said, I can tell you about the planning I'm doing locally and in some other parts of the world, but I don't know about mediation. He said, well, you just come and talk about it. So the conversation with him got me interested, and it was right at the time in which Bill Pendleton from the Ford Foundation pulled together a group of mediators and said, you guys should be thinking about environmental mediation. I didn't know, I never heard the term, didn't know what it meant, but was okay to participate in that. Ford Foundation was looking to incite some work in that area. They were going to offer some money. And that's when I met Pendleton. That's when I met Gail Bingham. I'm trying very hard to think about all the people that were in that first meeting. Some of Jerry Cormick was very much part of that group. And that group met and said, let's keep trying to formulate something about environmental mediation. Well, I knew what mediation was presumed to have meant because I got drawn in to this conversation with the labor mediators, the family mediators, Jeff Rubin, labor mediators, John Dunlop, famous dean of the labor mediators. I got drawn in with people doing military disputes because that was Roger's interest, fighting disputes, nation to nation. They weren't doing anything about natural resources, and they thought that what I was doing was making mediation for natural resources and land development. And because the Pendleton groups had started the conversation, Howard Bellman, Jerry Cormick, Gail, we were all very competitive. None of us was prepared to defer to any of the others about any definitions of anything, but at least I was in the conversation. And I just kept going about doing my business, which was public engagement in local decision making. And then I started writing, and I said, there's got to be a way to connect this up to the political, philosophical discussions about democracy. And there's got to be a way to connect this up to what the discussions were going on about environment, because I had just gotten involved with environmental impact assessment, separate track, separate thing, US, UK. And I started looking at environmental impact assessment and said, you know, here's a case where people have a legal right to be involved, and they're supposed to be considering alternatives, and there's supposed to be a decision document at the end which says, here's what takes account of all the things all these people said. So I was seeing EIA, which looked like the most technical of the things I was working on, as, oh, here's the embodiment of this process. And the planner should play a neutral role, not pick a favorite. And so maybe the planner can help to mediate this.
So you also at this time was you were studying under a NATO project, citizen participation and citizen activism in Europe. How did those things come together?
A firm was formed in London by a woman named Frances Fisher, an American woman, started an environmental consulting firm called ERM. And the manager of it was a guy named Robin Bidwell, Oxford guy, I think. And Robin and Francis started doing EIA in Europe. And the European Union wasn't at that point yet, but there were groups like NATO that had research arms that were saying, there's a responsibility in locating new military facilities. There's a responsibility in dealing with waste, that you have to look at all these options. And we drafted the legislation at the request of the Dutch government for EIA based on the US version. The Brits weren't ready to do it, but the Dutch were. So we spent a lot of time working in the Netherlands and met my lifelong friend, Frans Evers, who's still alive and working today and became the chief in charge of everything, not the political top figure, but the managing director of a very elaborately growing environmental ministry, operating by these new environmental impact guidelines that had participation requirements connected to them, and ERM was hired to run experiments with that. Later, not much later, but later, same thing happened in Tokyo. There were no EIA requirements. ERM was asked to get involved. We drafted the EIA requirements for Tokyo. We ran them in 2 locations. And I got involved with 100 countries that tried to pass environmental impact assessment laws modeled on the US. And in some cases, just a short-term advisor. In other instances, sending them the people to actually run the process of making those EIA processes work. And so it went. Environment, EIA, a controlled thing about environment with a global pattern to it that only made sense to me if you treated it as an occasion for finding all the relevant stakeholders, working through options, and producing a proposed decision for minimizing adverse risk and maximizing adverse gain. And I, at that time, became the editor of the Environmental Impact Assessment Review. It went on, still exists. For 20 years, I edited it 6 times a year, issues. And I built into it all of the dispute handling aspects of environmental decision making as if they were part of the same thing. It was not an ADR, alternative dispute resolution journal. It was an environmental planning journal. But every issue, there were articles on how do you get people with different views to do joint fact-finding to understand and forecast the nature of the risks. ERM still is, an important part of my story. ERM went from Florence and Robin, and they hired a guy with the unlikely name of Metternich, who was a relative of the earlier Europe builder Metternich, and they built a trans-European environmental consulting firm by buying out every other major consulting firm in Europe. And then they proceeded to other parts of the world. And then they merged with ERM US and became the largest environmental consultancy in the world, and they still are. Robin, at some point, stepped back and became head of their philanthropic operation. But I've been connected with all of these environmental folks for whom dispute resolution was part of environmental planning. It was never a separate thing. But from the first meeting with Roger kept saying, look, we have all these people doing separate things, we really should pool our efforts and see if we can build a field and a theory of negotiation and dispute resolution, because there really wasn't anything in the popular eye at the time. And then all of them being older than me, I was by far the youngest, they said, you run it. And I said, I'm just making my way as a faculty member at MIT, running a multi-university, Harvard, MIT, Tufts joint venture, and raising the money to do it because the university's not going to fund it. Not a great way for me to pursue my academic interests. They said, this is important. You have to do this.
So Larry, I was intrigued a bit back when you talked about the Ford meeting and some of the dispute resolution folks there and how they were competitive with each other. And can you begin to define the camps that you saw? What were the different philosophies or ways of thinking about dispute resolution at that point in time?
Howard Bellman had a distinctly labor view of dispute resolution on environmental things. He was the Secretary of Labor, but he subsequently became the person most responsible in Wisconsin for environmental dispute resolution. And Bellman was out in Washington State, and he was determined to do Snoqualmie and to take this very big event and prove that this could work. Gail had a more systematic view of it, and she was in the D.C. area. She had been in California, but she was Gail Bingham had been in the D.C. area. Each of the people chose a geography and a way of framing the environmental disputes that were different. And if I pressed myself, or if I had known to make the list, there'd be 6 or 7 others. And we all went about our bit, doing in our different place some version of what we thought environmental dispute resolution should be. We met at the constant meetings of the SPIDER membership, the Society for Professionals in Dispute Resolution, that used to just have labor and other as forms of dispute resolution. It was just labor mediators. And other, over very short time, 5-6 years, got to be bigger in terms of mediators in the membership than labor, which pissed the labor people off something fierce.
So Larry, you've already started talking about the role of the planner as a mediator and the role of neutrality, and you talked about the different schools within the field. How do you see the role of the mediator in resolving environmental and public policy conflicts?
I'm still pretty much hung up on some of the same ideas. Just this week, I'm finishing a chapter for a new Oxford handbook on fair public participation from a global perspective. And what we're supposed to be doing is talking about some of the new ideas for public participation. And each of the chapters of new is being critiqued by a well-known person on the dispute resolution side. Carrie Menkel-Meadow has just finished a review of my chapter. And we've been in this pairing for at least 30 years in all kinds of publications. I don't think the people who paired us thought we were paired. They thought she's a law professor and has a certain view of ADR, and this guy's a practitioner or a pracademic, as I'm sometimes called. And he's talking about practice, usually from planning and environment. And he does talk about public involvement, but we'll ask her to say, whether his new ideas about public involvement and dispute resolution measure up to what the latest thinking is, because Kerry writes more than anybody about constantly shifting trends in ADR, in dispute resolution. And so I'm going to use this chapter and her reaction as a way of bringing everything right up to the present and answering your question. But what I said in the chapter was, here's the report that came out about 10, 15 years ago on criteria for evaluating public engagement. Excuse me. And it had about 16 criteria, and it was a National Academy of Sciences study, and they had all kinds of applied social scientists laying out these criteria. And I took the whole list, every item on it, and said, let me use them to evaluate what my clinic is now doing at MIT to assist communities fighting about the siting of renewable energy facilities, because that is a big deal phenomenon sweeping across the country, and it is a very frightening obstacle to our need to transition to renewables as part of our American commitment, global commitment to climate transition. And I said, we're going to, at a school, at a university, play a neutral role. And I'm going to avoid any linkage of these conversations to everything else that's being talked about right about now with regard to the university's role in international political conflict. But nevertheless, a neutral role. We would have a team of students, and they would work with the parties in a place where there is a facility under dispute. We would have a full-time professional mediator who would assist. Carrie seems to have missed that point. She said, how can a group of students with a semester's training be able to help communities that are really torn up in political way? But have a mediator. And the first 4 weeks of the semester, the students take very intensive 3 to 5 week online video training that it took me some substantial amount of time and leaning on my friends to produce. 60 mini lectures are contained in these 4 one-week programs of 5 hours a week that model the problem, model the solution, model what it actually looks like with videographers going out to tribal places where they're fighting these facilities and getting interviews with everybody involved and all the footage and showing it. And then it comes back into these MOOCs, these video training programs. And at the end of the 4 weeks, there's an exam. You don't pass the exam, you can't continue in the course, you have to drop. But at the end of the 4 weeks, if you pass the exam, you're then matched up with one of 2 places that my teaching colleague and I recruited, and the students now begin work for 8 more weeks to see if they can assist the parties, not in reaching a written binding agreement, no, instead in going through a conversation as we complete the stakeholder assessment during those first 4 weeks, giving them a group of people. Can they meet? In this case, if they're local, we'll meet in person. If they're, as they were in this instance, 2 cases in Michigan, we will meet virtually. I would send the students out for 1 trip to meet everybody, but the weekly meetings have to happen online. And the goal is to see, can we reach any kind of informed agreement on an alternative proposal plus at this site, where plus could be any kind of community benefits agreement agreed upon by all of the stakeholders gathered through the stakeholder assessment process. Could they agree on a different site, different technology, different scale of construction, different timing of construction, different methods of construction, different visual barriers to the finished product, some kind of sharing of revenue through joint ownership, joint exploration? This is just a tiny fraction of things that could be considered in these conversations, facilitated by the student team and the mediator. And the idea is, if at the end of 12 weeks, the developer's ready to put in a new proposal, then that's the measure of success. It's not just dialogue. And I've had to explain over and over again that the model of dispute resolution in the public arena is action-oriented.
Yeah, so I have a sense that your planning background is intersecting very much with your
Exactly.
development of mediator, that it's really about imagining a future in which there are good outcomes
For all,
for all, and
in their view.
in their view, but also helping them move from where they are, which is in a place of opposition, without choices, to a place of imagining a future where it's a greater opportunities for the people who are the stakeholders.
And you know, because we've worked together long enough, that is precisely how we see planning.
But this is not how many people see mediation.
Well, it's what I've had to work harder on, to say, I know you know a mediator as an individual, not a team, who's come in after there's been a rupture in relationships between the parties, and parties are comparing the outcome to what's likely to happen in court if we go to court, and there's a highly managed and stilted conversation managed by lawyers for both sides, and even if there's a mediator, and the goal is to reach a written agreement that can be legally enforceable. And those attributes and characteristics are not what I'm presenting when I'm talking about doing the public's business, doing a better job of engaging people who are affected by government decision-making, have a right to participate in it, in trying to reach not a majority, not a vote, but a collective sense that if this is the agreement, then all of us can live with it. It's not perfect, but if this is what the decision makers will accept, and I know I got my most important concerns in it, I'm better off backing this agreement with everybody else feeling the same way than I am in saying there were 30 of us in this process, and we won 26-4 on a vote, and we're now giving that to the officials, or the officials were somehow sitting in it, which they can't, but they do anyway in many places. And then you have an unhappy minority. No effort was made to meet their interests. Power won out, and now you're still back in the conflict in the place with an even higher line to jump over for the next case, because the people that lost, they are ready for blood. They will give everything to fight the next case.
So part of this, what you're talking about, is a story of people coming to understand each other's concerns and things like that and moving forward. Can you talk a little bit about the sense of how you know that the result of a process like this would in fact be in the public interest?
Right. That's the key philosophical, theoretical question always for 50 years. And you know my very short first answer, which is, if it's fairer in the eyes of the parties than what their alternative was, if it was an agreement reached efficiently in that it saved money and did not leave potential joint gains unclaimed at all, if it was stable in that people continued to live up to their commitments and didn't abandon them the minute implementation started, and if in retrospect, from those who knew what the parties knew at the time and knew about the issue, it seemed wiser, if it was fairer, more efficient, more stable and wise, it is by definition more in the public interest than the options available to them.
And what would be the role of the public policy or environmental mediator in making sure that happens, independent of the conveners or other stakeholders in the group?
Right. The stakeholders in the group are there to pursue their interests. The conveners are there because ultimately they have to make a decision legally. They can't turn a formal decision over to an ad hoc group. It's illegal. To get to the role of the mediator, I got to start with the role of the participants, the stakeholders. Then I got to look at the role of the officials, the conveners. And then I can more clearly explain my view about the role of the mediators. There's lots of people who are there because they have a right or feel they have a right to be involved in a decision. And they're not embarrassed by what they do and don't know. They're willing to learn more, but they're there basically because they feel that their interests should be served. The conveners and officials have to make the final decision. No one should ever confuse a mediated public dispute with government decision-making. All we produce in mediated government disputes, resolution efforts, are proposed decisions made by agreement. We hand them to the officials, the conveners, the elected bodies. It's your decision. But would you like to know what you could recommend as your decision, that all groups will stand up and cheer and vote for you next time and think you did a good job? Your call. And we produce that. It may take a written form, but it is not the agreement most of the time. So here's the mediator whose job it is to make that, to facilitate that process. So the mediator has got to make an extra effort to make sure all the relevant stakeholders know about this, can meet and choose someone to represent their shared interests, and to manage the discussion on a repeated basis, an extended basis, so the parties can learn what each other's concerns are, learn enough about the issue, learn enough about alternatives that they can quickly generate some options for mutual gain. And then the mediator has to deal with the effort to close out and get agreement, which could include being the writer, not necessarily of the agreement, which could include assisting, herding, supporting, encouraging, browbeating the members to try harder, to hear what the others are saying and be inventive about something that would be pretty good for all the others and great for them. And that if they can play that role without appearing to take sides, then they can have the desired effect of moving the whole process toward consensus. They become the advocate of the process for getting consensus, informed consensus. They are not, I guess this is still a little bit controversial in some corners of our field, they are not advocates for a particular outcome. If they are, in my mind, they disqualify themselves as mediators and become advocates. And if the process wants advocates for one point of view, I don't see how that's a benefit, but if they do, fine, do that. But, and you have to live your life credibly to be seen as neutral, as nonpartisan, as someone helping all the others. You can't be a mediator Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and a lawyer advocate on Tuesday, Thursday. The word will quickly get out. You will never be viewed as neutral. Everyone will be trying to figure out where you stand. So the neutral, the mediator, has to help provide the mobilization and the structure, and then the exchanges, and then codify them, and maybe even be the spokesperson for the process with the world at large, either during the process if there's PR, or after the process if someone has to speak for the whole. It can't be a partisan. So that's my sense of what the role is of the mediator.
And there's one piece of this, though, and you said the outcomes have to be wise. It's not an advocate role, but it's a question of, does the mediator have any responsibility for ensuring that the outcome is in fact robust and durable and the other characteristics that you think the outcome should have?
Yes, and of course you know the answer to that question is yes, for sure, adamantly. So the question is, how do you do that and still maintain the independent, the neutrality that I just finished describing? And the answer for me has been that I work with teams of neutrals, with staff and teams, and I can go off and meet with one set of absolutely furious parties early in the process and say, let's talk about what you want to have the outcome be in this case. And they say this. And I say, let me ask you some questions to help prepare you for dealing with the other side. What if they said this? What would your response? What if you said this in return? What do you think their response would be? And what I'm doing is acting the roles of all the people they're going to have to convince, clearly in a sympathetic way to them, although my demeanor might be harsh because that's going to help them. But my sympathy is for the purpose of this meeting with them, to have them be as prepared as possible. And myself and my team have to do this and offer this with equal enthusiasm to each side separately, and then to the sides separately. And at any moment, if I betray an underlying partisanship, I'm out. Because the agreement to mediate is always contingent on all the parties being able to raise a question that, wait a minute, you are biased, you're not fair. You said that, you heard them, then you did this. No. Now, the one thing I ask in my contract is give me a chance to explain. Don't just throw me out the door without any conversation. Give me a chance to explain, because sometimes they're misconstruing a moment in which I'm advocating for them to understand the side of a party that's not present. And if I didn't do a good enough job of introducing it, they take it for my view. But they can't know my view by the time I'm finished.
So that's content related, but
Yes.
I'm still going to push
Process.
you on trying to think about, you're moving towards an agreement, the parties think it's great, but it's going to go into a public setting. What role does the mediator, or responsibility does the mediator have in that context?
Thank you. Fair enough. The thing about environmental disputes or resource management disputes, that if you get the wrong answer, you kill people. So you can't just get a happy answer. You can't just get a satisfactory answer. You have to get an answer that's not going to kill people, that's safe, right? Oh, you don't need to build that dam any bigger. It'll be fine. And we don't want to spend any more money than that. Oh, you don't have to worry about protecting that bit of habitat. There's lots of those animals elsewhere in the region. I know they think it's an endangered area, but it's not. Don't worry about it. Kill animals, kill people, kill plants, change environments, unintended on the part of the parties. Unacceptable. How does the mediator come in? Do I know everything about all the systems that are at risk? No. But I can ask questions about them. And mostly what I'm doing when we're trying to get to that part of the agreement that goes beyond the level of just the level of satisfaction of the interests of the parties, I'm trying to make sure the scientific and technical information has been incorporated adequately, that risk has been incorporated adequately. And that means I need to schedule for them to hear from people from outside who've been through similar situations. I need for them to ask questions which they take home and talk to experts that they want to find with regard to the substantive questions. And when we meet again, I'll say, so does anyone have any contribution on substantive question number 3? I know we're roughly in a good place, but the answer to this question could mean we have to start over again with some of the things we thought were easy and everybody liked and was happy with. So it is my responsibility not to say what that science is, not to interpret the correct science, but to get the group to confront what's going to happen if they don't make the best scientific technical judgments, get the group to put risk management mechanisms, contingent agreements into their agreement. Should there be a lot of uncertainty but still danger, that's got to be something that's added and that's worked out. And when there's no agreement on the technical piece, but they think everything else is settled, I might have to say, I can't be part of the presentation of this to the world at large. Not that I know the answer to everything, but I know you guys did not address this question adequately, and I think you're creating risk to yourselves and to others for some time to come. And so I don't think this is finished. Do you think it's finished? You want to report it? Leave me out.
So this raises a different kind of question, which has to do with the institutionalization of this. Because on the one hand, you're talking about public policy governance structures, which are highly institutionalized and have systems for making choices and decisions. And on the other hand, you're talking about an intervention that seeks to enable that governance system to make better decisions. But there doesn't seem to be institutional structures in place for that. There seems to be a lot of need to, at each individual's site, to create the process at some level. So how do you think about institutionalization? How much institutionalization is good for environment and public policy dispute resolution, and where would you draw the line for that?
The very, very short answer is more would be good. More institutionalization would be good. And I give you the most recent example in my mind because I just written a book with some colleagues in Canada, or written about Canada. For 20 years or more, people going to court in complex civil disputes have an option of saying, Judge, we've been trying to get this case resolved and been one technical problem after another. We know who you are, Judge. We want you to mediate this. The judge says okay and becomes the mediator. This is not annexed out like in California to JAMS, Judicial Arbitration Mediation Service, and then wait and see the result and then feed that back in and then just go on with the judicial process. This is to alter the judicial process and to make it into mediation. And there are many judges who've operated for decades this way who are very good at this, a few who are terrible at it, and the public finds out because the public asks, the parties ask, the lawyers ask for a judge to do what's called JDR, Judicial Dispute Resolution. And because it's private, there are no records. And so 25 years has gone by, and we have gotten permission the last couple of years from the highest court in the province of Alberta to follow 9 cases from the beginning when the parties are deciding whether they want to do JDR, all through the case, and then talking to all the parties privately after the case. The four judges, if there's 4 judges, multiple parties, 2 judges, the judge, the 4 lawyers, the single judge, and any experts the judge wants to call in, just like I was describing, a mediator can do. And it's not cross-examination of the expert witness the way it is in court. It's the way we would use a mediator. And what's so fascinating, this is about institutionalization, at the end of the process, which tends to take about a quarter at most as long as the same case going through judicial review, the parties say, great, we have an agreement. Over 80% of the time. And many of these are cases that have been in court for a decade, going from one thing to another venue, changing the issue, because nobody's satisfied with the results. And the judge has the option, if the parties ask, to make it binding at the end. And because he or she's a judge, they can do that. But only if the parties and their lawyers request it.
So it becomes a consent agreement.
And there's still no record of it, which means that you have to have the parties make their own joint record of it for implementation and enforcement. And the judge can sign it, but the judge can't produce an official record of it. But just think about that as an institutional innovation. It has the institutional strength of the court system for purposes of narrowing the case, matching up the mediator. It's all free to the parties because the judges are paid salaries. So it's not something saved for the elite to use mediation. It can take whatever time. Each of the judges is supposed to put in a quarter of their time in JDR if they're going to do JDR at all. And our book has the details of the 9 cases and raises all of the issues about justice.
So you've talked about institutionalizing in environmental impact assessment earlier. You talked about the judicial system, but many of the public policy disputes, like for instance the energy siting, you want to get before any of that happens.
Right.
How do you institutionalize in that context?
So institutionalization, yes, we need more. How to get it? Not so obvious. If we say, what are some examples of from 0 to 90 out of 100 of institutionalization of dispute resolution methods, efforts, energies? One I would point to, and I think it's still instructive, is negotiated rulemaking. We had a period in which Congress would pass a law with an emergency preamble, and then it would take 3 or 4 years for Congress to actually get agreement on a law. And the preamble said it was an emergency because there was some environmental issue that was problematic and needed attention. And the process just kept getting stuck down in partisan congressional politics. And through a whole series of actions on the part of several people, EPA agreed to undertake 20 experiments with a mediated process of negotiated rulemaking. Now, how to do rulemaking? Congress says there shall be clean air, and then agencies have to set up a procedure to get public input and agreement on what will the procedure be, and the regs, the regulations, are as important as the law. The law doesn't say specifically how to do stuff. The regs do. Regs are crucial. How do you get regulations agreed upon in an efficient way? And negotiated rulemaking achieved that. And a lot of the people who had worked on independent mediation of specific environmental disputes got incorporated into a squad working for EPA off a roster. And the roster is a really important word here because the roster stabilized both who would be accepted by way of pre-measurement of their credentials, what they would be paid, so there was no competition amongst them and they didn't have a bidding process that would get in the way of getting the right person from the roster to help in the right rulemaking situation. And the procedure, the method, became formalized through EPA. They said, oh, we have to use a particular federal law, Federal Advisory Committee Act, to get the people we've chosen through a stakeholder assessment with the help of a neutral to be the participants. But if they're really going to be participants on the equivalent of federal lawmaking, they've got to be formally on an advisory committee act. So a number of ways of institutionalizing aspects of applying dispute resolution where it hadn't been applied to the doing of something that had to keep on being done that was getting more and more contentious. And it worked. We did 20 experiments. I had the assignment to evaluate in writing the assignments and say, should this become now permanent? The answer was yes. Legislation was then passed to make permanent the option of doing negotiated or mediated rulemaking and not just the normal hassle of rulemaking. It's still there to this day. It's not used anywhere nearly as much as we imagined or hoped it would be. We assumed most rules would be switched over to this. But in some realms, it's still an option and still used and works.
And what are the barriers? Why is it not being used?
There's several different views. My view is it's not being used because there's no advocacy group with credibility under the banner of institutional reform continuing to push it and other things. So we used to have the Administrative Conference of the United States. It was made up of assistant secretaries of every federal agency, and their job was to improve the administration of justice. And we ran through a president who eliminated it, and it hasn't been reestablished in a meaningful way. And there's no there to push for you. Even when we have it, it's an option. We didn't replace existing systems, and there's still a few leftover folks who know they want to use it and know how to use it. But we have rosters, and you now have, depending on who's the president and who's staffing different agencies, more rosters than ever. Department of Interior has a roster. Department of Energy has a roster, not just EPA. And not just for negotiated rulemaking, for all of the regulation they have to do, which looks a lot like mediation of site-specific land disputes. The roster solves the problem of, is this legitimate? Yes, it is. Federal agency has it. Who can do it? Federal agency has a whole system for reviewing people, putting them on the roster. How are those folks going to get selected? Have a system, but it's not about competition for price. That's set. So we have still some elements in place for ongoing institutionalization of, at the national level. I created at one point in time state offices of mediation. I thought with the National Institutes of Dispute Resolution, let's get 10 or 15 governors to show that they can have the equivalent of a roster, a commitment to mediation on all kinds of state judgments that had to be made. And for about a decade, most of them worked just fine. Then new governors came in. I said, what is this office? I don't need this. I don't want this. It's not mine. It was my predecessor's special thing. And we made the mistake of thinking the only way we get it adopted is to make it a special thing of a governor. It was called the Governor's Office of Mediation. In California, when it slipped from being the governor's office to a state office of mediation and put into the university system so it was hidden in a budget, had a lot of staffers who did mediation, worked quite nicely for several decades. But in most places, if the person who advocates the institutionalization of mediation is replaced, the new person sees institutionalizing mediation as the old person's thing, and they don't want to do it. If they said...
So what do you do about that? I mean, how do you maintain consistency over administrations?
You have clients say, we like the way this worked before, the people using the administration of justice system. They go to the staff who were there and know how it works, and they say to the staff, we, all the parties fighting, want to have this. I'm involved right now with offshore wind in New England. The assumption is it's going to be the most important source of renewable energy up and down the Atlantic coast. It's a very difficult siting problem, and each state has its own say. And we are trying to bring together all of the industries, because that's who wants it, to reconsider the siting process requirements, bring together all the states, bring together all the fishing groups, all the whaling groups, all the industry groups together, and see if we can't make suggestions for an improvement in the siting process. And it will be a mediated process, and it will be housed at MIT's Energy Initiative, and it may take 2 years. And we have found private funding for it, but we can't take private funding from the industry, so it has to be philanthropic. And the parties are so scrunched up. I mean, there's all these international builders of renewable energy offshore are succeeding all through Europe and Asia. The biggest market they could have is the US. They're making very little progress because we have fractionated our siting process, allowing each state to do what it wants to do, and to have the decision about transmission lines be separate.
So, but we're back to the notion of herding stalemates, right? The idea that we create these processes when there's all the stakeholders think something should be happening and you can't get it to happen.
Yes, and one small step before that, it's not just all the stakeholders are hurting. There are critical players who would like to have this more regulated and thus more organized and thus more institutionalized. And if they're willing to put the effort and energy against it, the regulators are going to come along. It isn't just all at once, because that would be too hard to generate. But you have now a set of European builders of renewable energy. You have China, but it's not visible in the story on the East Coast. But you have the Europeans. They're succeeding wildly in Europe. So they know it can happen. Somebody has to convince them of some weird way of doing things. And we just haven't thought about this process and how to make it a mediated process in decades because we haven't done it. And now that it's clear, trying to do it with the old rules, with the new players, not working. Who could possibly convene the new players? It can't be Congress. It can't be the White House. That, as you noted earlier, is so partisan that any assumption about any proposed change is viewed as someone trying to put one over on the other side. So we need an independent entity, like a university, to say, we'll start by hosting some discussions out of the limelight, no press. We'll staff it with postdocs who know a lot about the technical stuff, because a lot of what's, I think, going to end up driving changes is the new technology that allows one floating plant to communicate directly to another, to another, to another through the water, and just connect to the grid at the two ends. And all the states go out of the story.
So Larry, you've created an extraordinary picture of the promise and the challenge of moving forward with more applications of conflict resolution and environmental and public policy disputes. If you were waving your magic wand around the future of the field, where do you think we ought to be innovating? Where do you think the work should flow as we continue to look to achieve the promise of this work?
Maybe in two surprising places. My feeling is that when the average worker comes into work in any public or private agency, if they had a set of expectations about how to deal with differences in the workplace and how disagreements should be handled for the good of the organization, and they had learned it. They learned it in elementary school, they learned it in middle school, they learned it in junior high school, they learned it at college. How do you deal with conflict in everyday life? And if it was just an essential DNA to the way people thought about operating, it would just go ahead. And my sense is we should be investing in not teaching negotiation as a technical skill in graduate schools. I'm not against it, but we should be teaching negotiation as a life skill in all of the lower grades. And I think this deals with some of the partisanship in the country too, which is, people listen to their parents, get angry at the other side. They've got nothing pulling them in any other direction about, yeah, but we're all part of the same side at some time. What does it mean to actually meet our interests and someone else's? We had a thing in school about that. We had an exercise we did. We had a practice that we did. So one answer is the educational piece, I argue, needs to be flooded with teaching in simple enough ways about negotiation as everyday life skills so that people expect that's how the problems will get solved. Mm-hmm. And same would go for people running for office. If their head had been hit so many times with, now everybody's job is, I'm not going to argue golden rule, I'm going to argue it on efficiency grounds, right? I'm just going to argue everybody, everywhere gets to do what they want to do more efficiently if they have a way of dealing with people who disagree with them that helps those people get what they want in a pretty good basis, and each person who's thinking they want something on a very good basis. I mean, the title of the book is Good for You, Great for Me. I tried to lay this out. I thought it was an alternative to getting to yes, because it's a process diagram, not 7 elements. And I thought it would be talking about all the users of it, all the people who are affected by the use of it becoming the market for it, rather than the people who want to provide the service continuing to be the primary market for this activity, and then figuring out how are we going to sell this, how are we going to sell this. And you can do stuff online now. I mean, my colleagues think still, 90% of them, that the way you teach online is you put a camera and a microphone in front of their lecture stand at the front of the room and capture it all and then put it on a tape. And I'm saying, no, think Disney. Nothing is more than 4 to 6 minutes. Everything has After Effects, and they don't know what I'm talking about. So I have tried to create now 7 rather elaborate MOOCs, or online teaching programs. Admittedly, they are still on the technical side, because that's the only way I can get the money from MIT to do it. But we are teaching at MIT the two most popular electives in all of MIT. You've got 800 students applying every semester. We can only take 44. Wow. And it's unbelievably can battle. It's negotiation is everyday life skills, taught by Bruno Verdini, former doctoral student of mine who's joined the MIT faculty. This is what he does, and the students they worship what he does in that class. And it's immediately spread to the whole institute. They're calling our department saying, can't you make more spaces? We're getting yelled at by our computer science majors who want to take this negotiation course. And it looks like you got it accepted for 3 different distribution requirements for undergraduates, which I did for a reason. And every day dealing with conflict, that's what students need to learn about, not as a technical skill, but as a life skill. Second part of this is we have operated by governmental decision-making systems that are routinized in a whole series of ways. We have journalism that's operated in a whole series of ways. We have universities with free speech assumptions that have operated in a whole series of ways. None of those are any good anymore. They have to be remade. MIT took 3 years to rewrite every word of a long statement on free speech and responsibility. And it is a discipline system, enforcement system administered by the faculty, not the central administration. And so when MIT's new president showed up and was asked by Congress, would you punish this? She tried to explain, we have a new free speech function. It's very, very clear. It's been written word for word by the faculty. The university is the holder of it, but it does not administer of it. And we don't throw people out. The faculty makes these decisions. It's the only university that's rejected the long-standing Gensler report from Chicago and written its own. And it's real clear that there are places on the campus where you can always demonstrate. No, you don't need a permit ahead of time. We just like to know that something's going to happen. There are other places where you cannot demonstrate, and you will be removed immediately because you're blocking other people's ability to do their work, go to class, and be part of the university. And once you have these explicit standards, and once you make it very clear, people can say whatever they want in a context unless it is aimed at a particular person and threatens them. That you can't do. And you will be stopped. And we need new ground rules to define how people can express certain forms of disagreement and how they can express anger or support. And we need to institutionalize those by engaging all the people in those places in that process. Top-down stuff's not going to work in the world we are now living in to update and modify the ground rules. People aren't going to listen to them. Just going to provoke more conflict. And I mean, the Program on Negotiation has been working with quite a few members of Congress. There is a bipartisan congressional group left. You wouldn't know about it from the news. And they have been rewriting procedures for how stuff should work in Congress. Because the ground rules we have, I was so sick of newspapers following old-fashioned journalism. You must show 2 sides to the story. You must quote one person. the notion of proportionality, the notion of subtlety in terms of difference, get rid of it. Make it really, really clear who's for and who's against, one spokesperson for each. That's balance. Does the media have a responsibility for suggesting what a better balance would be? They say no. Now, there was a very modest movement with a friend at NYU, Jay Rosen, who tried to move a different version of the media. He wasn't able to, he did it all the time he was teaching there, and he turned out people who wanted to go to the publisher and say, news is the news, but what you publish by way of special features, this is an area where you can engage the community in collaborative decision-making about how issues in the community can and should be engaged in a mediated way. Really, really hard as money was being cut from local media. But what has to happen, to answer your question, is we need new ground rules. Yeah. And someone who's affected by them needs to find allies, even if they have differences on other issues, and say, we demand that there be an occasion in which we're all involved and to change the ground rules, because originalist thinking isn't going to make it in our democracy. So I think having everybody expect it as part of their education, and having the institutions realize they have an obligation to change the ground rules, would be two of the best ways of moving forward. My sense is that AI is going to make a big difference. The way I describe to people of my generation who are scared to get the death of AI and don't understand it is, I say things like, how'd you like to have an assistant 24 hours a day, way smarter than you are, costs you nothing, can help you think through, prepare, write, draft, call anyone? Want it? I know all the downsides, but that proposal gets them interested. And then what we talk about is, okay, which tasks in your organizational role do you want help with? And I can give you more than one assistant. I can give you enough to do anything involved with communicating with others. I'm interested in the role that AI plays between humans, not as an alternative to one of them, between humans, to assist those humans in the interaction. This is part of changing the speed and the ground rules to put everybody into a situation where they have the resources, they have the time, they're supposed to figure out informed consensus reaction to the thing they think they're split on. That's where we should be heading. I don't think specializing it more and more and more. Let's talk about science diplomacy amongst people from the developing world who are the next generation of negotiators at COP 30. That's, I think, specializing more and more the negotiation means just fewer and fewer people are learning what they need to learn to be effective. We have to go the opposite direction. And at various times in my life, I've tried to create television shows or imagine television shows. Now I'm creating online courses. And, there's 20,000 people a year taking an online course that I built for $120,000, distributed by MIT. I don't have to think about it. It's free. Unless you want to take the exam at the end, then it's $129. Don't have to take the exam anywhere in the world. Take it on your own time. We can fill all of those airwaves with training, but it needs to be a more general kind of training, not a highly specialized kind of training. And I'm very optimistic that there's another generation of, whether they be urban planners who want to do public dispute resolution, or lawyers who want to do legal dispute resolution, or international relationists who want to do some kind of interstate solution. Another field I've developed along the way is water diplomacy. Every place there's shared waters, they need an agreement on how they allocating and taking care of the shared waters. There are over 800 such agreements. They are terrible. They are 99% brittle. They're all made at one moment in time, usually 25 years ago, that says on the Nile, the countries here at the beginning will get this much, this much, this much, all the way to the end where Egypt says, we're in charge.
Yeah.
You're in charge, you're the end. How can you be in charge? The Brits told us that we were in charge, so we're in charge. And what are you using the water that comes over the Aswan for? Oh, to grow stuff. And you're growing the most water-intensive crops you can think of and letting the rest of it just drip out into the sea. Well, we're in charge.
No sense.
There's an agreement, and nobody pays any attention to it anymore, and they can't even agree on who should come together to negotiate the agreement. We've got agreement between the U.S. and Canada on the in the Northwest on a river. The agreement's 50 years old. It's time to renegotiate it. There was nothing in the agreement about how they would meet during the 50 years to analyze how it was going and make adjustments.
Right.
No dispute resolution clause in these agreements. Okay, we have to have water agreements. And the big deal is there's 30% less water in the Jordan. So arguing Israel gets this much, the Palestinians get this much, and Jordan gets this much, and they demand to take out what they were promised. It's not there anymore.
No.
There's no mechanism for renegotiating it. That's all on us. The dispute resolution field created agreements that were going to be once and for all about natural resources. Crazy. And then if you had them, there has to be a meeting every quarter, and you share monitoring and gathering data, and then you try to come up with new options under different circumstances, and there's new technologies. There's people who would have to know how to do that.
So Larry, you're talking about how to change education generally amongst, in a sense, to change a culture. You're talking about capacity building. I'm wondering what the role of universities are, particularly around building practice and theory about dispute resolution, environmental policy making in the future.
We built the program on negotiation 40 years ago to improve the theory and practice of negotiation dispute resolution. We had faculty, the leadership came back from the Second World War. They're all soldiers, Roger, Fisher, Howard, Rafa, Frank Sander. They came back from the Second World War, as Bill Urey recently pointed out to us, and they said, never again. We're going to devote ourselves to the study of conflict and conflict resolution, and we're going to get better at it, and we're going to do research, which universities do, and we're going to help to improve practice. And for many decades, we brought people with problems in practice to the campus, and we brought faculty from many fields to give them their best advice. And in the process, we developed a common language that Roger and Bruce Patton and Bill should get all the credit. They developed the language of getting to yes, okay? That's 40 years ago. there's so much that's different, so much that we have learned, and we have not figured out how to codify. What does it mean to improve different kinds of practice in different ways now? And the reason is the faculty has shrunk down to a focus on research. Research that you could do in a classroom in a controlled experiment with student subjects. And you can test some assumption about silence. You can test some assumption about certain kind of information given in a certain way. But you're testing it on students because that's who you have available, and you're doing it in this controlled fashion. Where is the work with actual practice? Jim Sabinius brings great negotiators every year or two back, and we spend a week debriefing them on how they did something amazing in practice. But that's the only connection to practice, and it's after the fact, and it's more to celebrate what that person did. We need to have an equal number of practice-linked reflections, observations, even experiments. Even though that those could affect some people, if we're going to learn what works now, what's going to work better, who can do what. So we need more pracademics among us. We need academics with practice still going on. That's hard to do at these days where tenure is getting more and more exclusive and traditional research is what's rewarded. But we need to do that. Law schools still have more clinical professors than they have tenure professors. But in all the negotiation realms, we've worked hard to get tenured professors who are doing this research, which I don't believe is going to have any kind of breakthrough effect on practice. And we need to have more of a clinical program where we're working with practitioners, and it is as important as the controlled small research experiments that faculty are doing. We need to generate new ideas about what to try, what not to try, what worked, what didn't work. And you only can do that with practitioners reflecting on what occurred, on things that you helped practitioners to create. We call this PAR research, participatory action research. It's clinical teaching connected to practical research. We need a new generation of students interested in all aspects of dispute resolution who demand to be able to work on practice-related research in courses that get them credit.
Well, this seems like a great place to end. You've given us a vision for the future that in some ways harkens back to your early years for the next generation. Thank you very much for the hour and a half that you've spent with us, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. I appreciate being included, and I look forward to watching the hour and a half from all my other colleagues that I haven't seen or heard from in a while. Now, that will be great.